The dog refused to go into his kennel and slept on the snow at night. The owner didn't understand what was going on for a long time until one day he decided to look inside. What he saw there shocked him. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The small house at the edge of the city was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned after long days of labor. Michael had grown used to it, almost dependent on it, as though the silence of his little neighborhood was a kind of shelter from the world outside. He was a man who carried his own past with dignity, without ever speaking too much about it. His life was steady, his work as a mechanic modest but honest, and in his evenings he often found comfort in the steady rhythm of familiar routines. Yet, what truly gave warmth to his days was not the wood of the little house he owned, nor the tools in his garage, but the loyal companion who had been by his side for years now, a pit bull named Ray. Ray was no ordinary dog to Michael. He had found him as a pup in rough circumstances, rescued from a breeder who treated the animals as if they were objects to be sold rather than lives to be cherished. Michael had taken the frightened creature into his arms, and over time the fear and uncertainty in the pup's eyes were replaced with trust. That trust grew into an unshakable bond, the kind of loyalty that words could hardly capture. In many ways, Ray was family, the only constant that Michael could lean on without hesitation. Every evening when Michael returned from the garage, his clothes smelling of oil and steel, Ray would be there waiting. His body, muscular and strong, would tense with excitement, tail wagging furiously, eyes shining with devotion. No matter how hard the day had been, the sight of that wagging tail and those bright eyes never failed to soften the weight on Michael's shoulders. Together, they formed a quiet partnership, two souls who had weathered storms separately and now found peace together. When Michael decided to build a doghouse for Ray, he did not treat it as a mere shelter. He approached it the way a craftsman approaches a project that carries personal meaning. Every cut of wood, every nail, every piece of insulation was made with care. He wanted it to be sturdy enough to withstand the storms that rolled across the city's outskirts in winter, warm enough to protect Ray from the bitter cold, and spacious enough for the dog to stretch out in comfort. By the time it was finished, the structure looked more like a small cabin than a doghouse, with a pitched roof, insulated walls, and a thick layer of straw laid down as bedding. To Michael, it was proof of his devotion. To Ray, it became an instant fortress of comfort. That first night after its completion, Michael stood at the window in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching as Ray padded across the yard and ducked into the new home. It was a cold night already, though the snow had not yet begun to fall, and Michael smiled with satisfaction as he saw the pit bull settle inside. It gave him a sense of relief, knowing his friend would not have to curl up on the porch when the winter deepened. Life in those weeks moved with a gentle rhythm. Michael rose early for work. Ray trotted at his side whenever he could, and the evenings were filled with small moments of quiet happiness. Sometimes Michael would throw a ball across the yard, watching the powerful muscles of his dog ripple as he ran. Other times he would sit on the porch, Ray resting at his feet, while the night sky stretched endlessly above them. The doghouse stood like a little beacon at the edge of the yard, always ready to receive its inhabitant. Then winter came in earnest. December mornings brought biting winds that cut against the skin, and the air was filled with the smell of snow before it even began to fall. Michael noticed the change in the air and felt grateful again for the work he had put into the doghouse. He imagined Ray curling up inside, breathing warmth into the straw, safe from the bitter cold that was sure to arrive. It was the kind of foresight that made him feel proud as both a craftsman and a caretaker. But something unexpected happened. One evening, after the first thin blanket of snow had covered the ground, Michael looked out through the window and saw Ray not inside the doghouse, but lying outside of it. The pit bull was stretched out on the snow in front of the doorway, his body stiff but alert, as though he were guarding the entrance. Michael frowned, puzzled. At first he thought perhaps Ray was only resting for a moment, but as the hours passed the dog did not move. Even as snowflakes gathered on his back, he remained in position, head resting on his paws, eyes trained on the yard. Michael stepped out into the night, his boots crunching against the snow, his breath visible in the cold air. He called to Ray, expecting the dog to rise and greet him eagerly as always. But Ray merely lifted his head and gave a low whine before laying it back down. It was unusual, but Michael told himself it was probably nothing. Dogs sometimes behaved strangely, and perhaps Ray simply preferred the fresh air. Still, the sight left a faint unease in his chest. The following morning, Michael rose before dawn as he always did, pulling on his jacket and stepping outside to greet his companion. The yard was covered in frost, and the air carried the sharp sting of winter. Ray was in the same spot, lying before the entrance of his house, and though he wagged his tail when he saw his master, he did not rise. Michael called again, but Ray stayed close to the doorway, his body half blocking the entrance. When Michael stepped closer, the dog stood up quickly, his posture stiff, almost defensive. For a fleeting moment, Michael thought he heard a faint growl, though it was quiet, hesitant, as if Ray himself did not want to show it. Michael stopped in his tracks, uncertain of what to make of it. He looked down at the dog, who now stared at him with eyes both familiar and strange. They were still the eyes of his companion, but there was something else within them, an urgency, a plea, as if Ray was saying without words, "Do not come closer." That morning passed in silence, the unease growing stronger within Michael. He tried to push it away, to remind himself of the years of trust between them, but as he worked in the garage, the image of Ray lying in the snow would not leave his mind. It was the beginning of something he could not yet name, but he felt it in his bones. Life in his quiet little house was about to change in ways he had never expected. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that day, Michael looked again through the frosted window and saw his loyal companion stretched across the snow before the doghouse, still guarding, still refusing to go inside. Something was waiting there, and Ray knew it. Michael, for the first time in many years, felt a stir of unease in the place he called home. The next few days passed with a heaviness that Michael could not shake. The memory of Ray lying outside in the snow, instead of enjoying the comfort of his carefully built doghouse, kept circling through his mind. Each evening, when the cold grew sharper and the snow fell more steadily, he hoped to glance out the kitchen window and see the dog finally curled up inside, safe and warm. Yet every time his gaze found the yard, the picture was the same. Ray lay stretched out across the entrance like a soldier at his post, as though his body alone were the barrier between whatever lay within and the rest of the world. The strangeness only grew more pronounced. On one particularly frigid morning, when the frost lay thick on the branches of the bare trees and the ground crunched loudly underfoot, Michael stepped outside to bring Ray his breakfast. He carried the bowl of food in his hands, expecting his companion to run to him with the usual enthusiasm. The dog did indeed rise, wagging his tail, eyes bright as always at the smell of food. Yet, when Michael took a step toward the entrance of the doghouse, Ray's posture shifted in an instant. The pit bull's body stiffened, his muscles coiled, and he moved quickly, positioning himself directly in front of the doorway. At first, Michael thought he had misread it, but then came the sound. Low, almost reluctant, but unmistakable. A growl. It was not the savage, furious sound of a dog attacking, but rather the warning tone of one who would not allow passage. Michael froze, the bowl of food still in his hands, his eyes fixed on the animal he trusted more than anyone else. The growl deepened for a moment as he leaned forward, and then, when he stepped back slightly, it quieted again. Ray looked up at him, then with an expression that tore at Michael's heart. The eyes were pleading, almost sorrowful, as if the dog were begging him to understand something. "Please, not here. Please, not now." Michael stood for a long while in the snow, uncertain what to do. He had never seen Ray behave this way, never toward him, and it unsettled him to his core. He finally set the bowl down on the ground, a few feet away from the doghouse. Ray moved to it quickly, his tail wagging again, and the tension seemed to melt away, though his body remained angled just slightly toward the entrance, as if he needed always to be aware of it. Later that day, when Michael returned from work, he tried again. He had spent the hours in the garage thinking it over, telling himself it must be something simple. Perhaps a wild animal had crawled in during the night seeking warmth, and Ray was simply uneasy. Perhaps the doghouse smelled strange, or perhaps something about it had shifted. But these explanations did not sit right with him. His instincts told him there was more to it. So when he approached the yard again that evening, his breath fogging in the icy air, he tested his theory. He walked toward the doghouse slowly, his hands visible, his voice calm. Ray rose immediately, positioning himself at the threshold. When Michael continued, the growl returned, soft but firm. The man stopped, staring at his dog with a mixture of confusion and frustration. He remembered the nights when Ray was only a pup, curled trembling against his chest after being pulled from the neglect of his first home. He remembered the way trust had blossomed between them over the years, strong enough that he could handle the dog's food, his toys, even his wounds without fear of protest. And now, here was Ray, standing like a guard against him, warning him not to come closer. The snow continued to fall, covering the roof of the doghouse in a glistening layer, but Ray seemed unconcerned about his own discomfort. He settled once more before the doorway, lying down heavily in the snow. The sight pained Michael, who knew his companion would be warmer inside, but it was clear the dog had no intention of going there. That night, Michael sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold between his hands, staring blankly through the frosted window. He could see Ray's silhouette in the moonlight, stretched across the entrance like a sentinel. The pit bull's steady presence should have brought comfort, but instead it filled him with questions that had no answers. Something inside that doghouse held Ray's full attention, something powerful enough to make him forsake his own comfort and challenge the one person he had always obeyed without hesitation. Sleep came poorly that night. Michael tossed and turned, haunted by the look in Ray's eyes, the mixture of warning and plea, the silent message that he could not decipher. By the time dawn came, pale and brittle across the snow-covered yard, Michael had resolved that he needed to learn more. He could not go on wondering. That morning, he stepped out once again, the air cutting at his lungs. Ray stood, wagging his tail in greeting, but the moment Michael's steps drifted toward the doghouse, the pit bull shifted again into that defensive stance. The low rumble of a growl echoed faintly in the crisp air. Michael stopped and exhaled slowly, realizing he could not simply force his way past. If he tried, It would only break something sacred between them. He had to be patient. He had to find another way. Throughout the day, he carried the weight of uncertainty with him. At the garage, while working beneath the hood of a rusted car, his hands moved by instinct, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of possible explanations, some of them sensible, others more wild. Could another animal truly have claimed the shelter? Was Ray guarding against it, or was he protecting it? The questions spun in his mind until he felt dizzy with them. That evening, the scene repeated itself as though scripted. Ray outside, refusing to enter, watching his master with careful eyes. The pit bull's breath came in steady puffs, his fur dusted with snowflakes, yet he looked resolute, unshaken by the cold. Michael stood in the yard, hands shoved deep into his pockets, torn between admiration and worry. He could not deny the dog's determination, nor could he ignore the chill of unease that ran down his spine each time he thought of what might be concealed inside that wooden structure. The quiet neighborhood offered no answers. Lights glowed warmly in the windows of nearby houses. Children's laughter carried faintly through the winter air. And yet, here in his own yard, Michael felt the tension of a mystery that belonged only to him and his dog. When he finally went inside for the night, he left with a final glance at the loyal animal who had become something else entirely. A guardian, a barrier, and perhaps the key to something he could not yet understand. And so the days unfolded, each one mirroring the last, each one deepening the riddle. Ray, faithful companion, now stood against him, though never with hatred. Always there was that strange mixture of defiance and sorrow, as if the dog longed to explain, but could not. The snow thickened on the ground, the nights grew colder, and Michael's sense of unease grew heavier. It was clear now that this was no simple quirk of canine behavior. Something waited inside that doghouse, hidden from him, and Ray would not allow him to know it. Michael began to realize he could not continue this way. He would have to act. He would have to find a way to uncover the truth, no matter how much it pained him to trick or betray his friend. Because in his heart, he knew that trust could not survive forever under the shadow of secrecy. And, with that knowledge, he prepared himself for what would come next. He had watched, he had waited, and he had seen enough. The time for patience was nearing its end, and Michael understood that the next step would test both his loyalty and his courage. The decision Michael made that morning was not a simple one. He knew in his heart that forcing his way into the doghouse was impossible, not because Ray was stronger than him, but because their bond meant more than any mystery. He could not risk shattering years of trust by barging through his dog's warnings, yet the thought of leaving the situation unresolved gnawed at him with every passing hour. He found himself turning the problem over in his mind as he worked in the garage, his hands greasy and aching from the weight of wrenches, but his thoughts elsewhere. He began to realize that if he was to find the truth, he would need to do so with patience, quietly, by watching and waiting. And so he decided that he would become the observer rather than the intruder. That very night, as the snow came down softly, blanketing the yard in white, Michael pulled the curtains of his kitchen window just slightly aside. From there, the yard was visible, washed in the pale light of a half-moon. Ray was where he had expected him to be, lying across the entrance of the doghouse, his body blocking the way in, his eyes bright and watchful. The sight sent a shiver through Michael, not because it was frightening, but because it was so deliberate. The dog was not merely resting there. He was guarding something, and he would not allow even his master to pass. The hours stretched on, the clock ticking faintly in the kitchen. Every now and then, Michael would glance away from his book or the tools spread across the table, but his gaze always returned to the yard. Ray had hardly moved. The pit bull's breath rose in visible clouds, his body stiff in the cold, but he did not yield. When Michael finally went to bed, it was with the image of his dog's silhouette seared into his thoughts, unmoving and determined, as though carved into the snow itself. The following morning brought no relief. When he stepped outside, the frost cracked beneath his boots, the air sharp and bitter against his skin. Ray rose to greet him, tail wagging for a brief moment, but the instant Michael's steps carried him closer to the doghouse, the pit bull stiffened again. His growl was low, not hostile but insistent, a command more than a threat. Michael stopped in place, his breath escaping in a sigh of frustration. He turned back, and as he did, the growl faded into silence. Ray wagged his tail again, even nudged against him, but Michael could not shake the memory of that guarded stance. So he began his days with a kind of ritual. He would feed Ray, pet him, and then return to the house, only to stand by the window or linger on the porch, watching. At first, he expected something obvious to occur, a sudden movement from within, the flash of another creature's eyes, some sign that would reveal what Ray was protecting. But nothing came. Only the steady, ceaseless vigilance of his companion. At night, the atmosphere was heavier. The neighborhood was quiet, the sound of children who had played in the snow during the day now faded into stillness. Michael would sit in his living room, lights low, and catch sight of Ray through the glass. Sometimes the pit bull shifted slightly, lifting his head at the smallest sound, ears pricked, gaze fixed on the darkness of the yard. Other times he lay flat, yet always in front of that entrance. It was as if his entire being was devoted to guarding what lay inside. Michael tried to imagine what could possibly command such loyalty. If it were merely a threat, a raccoon or some other intruder, surely Ray would have driven it out or killed it by now. If it were something the dog feared, he would not remain so steadfast. No, the truth must be different. It was not fear that drove Ray to this vigil, nor anger. It was protection. He was guarding something, but what? The days passed, each one mirroring the last, until the weight of it settled deep into Michael's chest. At work, his colleagues began to notice his distraction. A customer would ask about the repairs on their car, and he would answer absent-mindedly, his mind still lingering on the snow-covered yard and the dog who would not move. Even his sleep grew restless. He dreamed of shadows shifting inside the doghouse, of faint cries carried through the wind, of eyes watching him from within. One evening, as he prepared to close the garage, a neighbor stopped by. It was Mrs. Henderson from across the street, bundled tightly in her coat, her breath rising in the frigid air. She asked casually about Ray, having noticed the dog's unusual behavior. Michael forced a smile, telling her everything was fine, but he saw the doubt in her eyes. The truth was too strange to share, and so he carried it silently, a secret that grew heavier by the day. The more he watched, the more convinced he became that Ray's behavior was not random. Every action, every growl, every glance seemed calculated. The dog was not simply keeping himself away from the house, he was keeping Michael away too. It was as if he was saying, "This does not belong to you anymore. This belongs to me, and I will not let you interfere." On one particularly bitter night, when the wind howled against the windows and the snow lay thick upon the ground, Michael wrapped himself in a heavy coat and stepped outside. He stood in the yard for a long time, his breath stinging in his chest, his eyes fixed on Ray. The dog did not stir from his place. He only watched, his gaze shifting briefly to Michael, then back to the entrance of the doghouse. The snow swirled around them, and the silence pressed heavily upon the man's shoulders. He felt, in that moment, as though he were standing at the edge of something unknown, something that had settled in his life without his permission. The anxiety gnawed at him. He could not endure this uncertainty forever. Ray was guarding something, and whatever it was had claimed the comfort of the doghouse and, by extension, the peace of their home. Michael realized he could not wait indefinitely. The time was coming when he would need to act, not as an observer, but as someone willing to uncover the truth, even if it meant deceiving his own companion. But for now, he returned to his place at the window, the reluctant witness to a mystery unfolding quietly in the snow. Ray lay steadfast, his body blocking the entrance, his eyes never straying far from what he protected, and Michael, in the warm glow of his house, felt the cold weight of uncertainty settle deeper into his bones. He would not remain an observer forever. The moment of choice was drawing near, and with it the risk of everything he valued most, the trust of his only true friend. Michael knew by then that waiting would not give him the answers he needed. He had tried patience. He had stood at the window for nights on end. He had watched with the uneasy fascination of a man who suspects his life is changing, but cannot yet grasp how. Yet no matter how long he observed, no matter how many hours he gave to quiet watching, the mystery inside the doghouse remained untouched. Ray kept his vigil day after day, night after night, his body blocking the entrance, his low growl warning whenever Michael's steps came too close. It was clear that whatever was inside mattered to the dog more than warmth, more than obedience, more even than their bond. The time for observation was over. Michael understood that if he was ever going to learn the truth, he would have to act, and that meant tricking the one creature who had never betrayed him. The decision left a sour taste in his mouth. He sat at the kitchen table late one night, elbows on the wood, staring down at his own hands as if they might offer counsel. Outside, the snow swirled lazily in the dim light, and through the frosted glass he could just make out Ray's form stretched before the doghouse. He thought of the years behind them, of the trust carefully built and never once broken, of the way the dog's eyes had always met his with unwavering loyalty. Now he was planning to manipulate that trust, to lure Ray away and lock him inside while he investigated what was hidden. The thought felt like betrayal. But what choice did he have? Secrets, even those held by a dog, could not be left to grow unchecked. He began the next morning. It was a Saturday, the kind of day when the garage could wait, when he had hours to devote to a task that demanded careful execution. He woke early, the gray light of dawn stretching weakly across the snow, and set about preparing. From the refrigerator, he retrieved a slab of meat he had been saving, a cut thick with marbling, its scent rich even through the cold air. He placed it on the cutting board and sharpened his knife slowly, deliberately, the sound ringing faintly through the quiet kitchen. Ray was in the yard, unaware, lying in his usual post before the doghouse. Michael could almost feel the weight of the dog's presence even through the walls. Slice by slice, he cut the steak into small pieces, each one carefully trimmed, until the bowl was heaped with bite-sized morsels. He knew Ray would not be able to resist. The pit bull loved meat in any form, but fresh beef drove him to excitement unlike anything else. Michael paused once, his hand resting on the knife, and wondered again if he was doing the right thing. He could hear in his mind the low growl of his companion, the sorrow in his eyes as if begging him not to interfere. He pushed the memory aside and carried the bowl to the door. When he stepped outside, the cold air bit into his skin. Ray rose at once, tail wagging, ears perked. His joy at seeing Michael was genuine, untouched by suspicion. Michael knelt in the snow, hiding the bowl behind his leg, and scratched behind the dog's ears. Ray pressed close, his breath rising in warm clouds, his body quivering with affection. Only then did Michael draw the bowl into view, placing it before the pit bull's nose. The reaction was instant. Ray's eyes lit up, his body trembling with excitement, his mouth opening in a low whine of joy. He sniffed eagerly, licking his lips, the temptation overwhelming. But then something unexpected happened. When Michael stood and took a step backward, gesturing toward the house with the bowl in hand, Ray hesitated. His tail wagged uncertainly, his ears flicked back, and his gaze shifted over his shoulder to the doghouse. He whined softly, torn between the lure of the meat and the silent demand of his vigil. Michael's heart clenched at the sight, at the way his dog seemed caught between two loyalties, hunger and duty. For a moment, he thought the plan would fail. He crouched again, speaking softly, coaxing. He waved a piece of meat in his hand, the scent thick in the air. Ray whimpered, his body shifting back and forth. Finally, with a shudder of resolve, the pit bull stepped forward. He followed Michael across the yard, his eyes fixed on the bowl. Relief swept through Michael as they reached the porch. He opened the kitchen door, set the bowl down just inside, and Ray bounded forward, unable to resist any longer. The dog plunged his muzzle into the food, his tail whipping like a flag. Michael's chest tightened. This was the moment. He backed out quickly, pulling the door shut behind him. The latch clicked, and Ray was inside. At once, the pit bull realized what had happened. He lifted his head, chunks of meat clinging to his jaws, and ran to the door. He pawed at it, claws scraping against the wood, his bark sharp and insistent. He whined, leapt at the glass, his eyes frantic. Michael stood on the porch, staring back at his companion, his heart heavy with guilt. He could see the confusion in Ray's gaze, the sense of betrayal. For the first time, the trust between them had fractured, even if only for a moment. But he could not turn back now. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the snow, and made his way across the yard. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind him, Ray barked louder, the sound filled with desperation. Michael clenched his fists, fighting the urge to abandon his plan, to rush back and release his friend. Instead, he pressed forward. The doghouse loomed before him, quiet, its doorway dark. The snow crunched beneath his knees as he crouched before the entrance. His breath misted in the cold, his pulse racing in his ears. He leaned closer, peering into the shadows. For the first time in days, he was within reach of the secret his dog had so fiercely guarded. He knew that whatever lay inside would change everything, though whether for better or worse, he could not say. And still, even with Ray locked away, Michael felt the weight of his companion's gaze. Through the kitchen window, he could see the pit bull watching him, eyes wide, body pressed against the glass. The sound of his barking filled the yard, echoing off the snow. Michael swallowed hard, bracing himself. He was about to uncover the truth, and there would be no turning back. Michael's heart hammered as he knelt before the entrance of the doghouse, the cold seeping through the fabric of his jeans, the snow crunching under his weight. The air was sharp in his lungs, each breath leaving a ghostly cloud that lingered and then vanished into the night. Behind him, Ray barked and scratched at the kitchen door, his voice rising with every passing second, a mixture of desperation and fury. Michael tried to shut it out, though each sound cut through him like a knife. He knew he had broken something sacred in locking his companion away, but there was no turning back. The dog's behavior had been too insistent, too purposeful for him to continue ignoring it. He had to know what lay inside. At first, the shadows revealed nothing. His eyes strained against the darkness, catching only vague shapes. The rough texture of the wooden boards, the straw scattered across the floor, the hollow depth of the small space. He leaned closer, narrowing his gaze, waiting for his pupils to adjust. The barking grew louder behind him, frantic now, and Michael could almost imagine Ray hurling his body against the door to break free. The man's pulse quickened, the sensation of vulnerability crawling over his skin. Half his body was outside in the snow, half of him leaned dangerously close to a space that could contain anything. Then movement flickered in the dark. At first it was subtle, the faint shift of shadow against shadow, and then it became clearer. A small form stirred within, and a pair of eyes glinted back at him in the gloom. Michael jerked slightly, his instincts shouting at him to pull away, but he held his ground. The shape became clearer with each passing second until he saw it. A cat. Not just any cat, but a thin, ragged mother with fur matted from the cold. Her body was curled protectively, her yellow eyes wide and unblinking as they met his. She did not move to attack, though he could hear the faintest hiss rise from her throat. She was not about to flee either. She stayed, rigid and trembling, her posture one of defense and desperation. Only then did Michael notice the movement beneath her. The small wriggling forms pressed against her belly. His breath caught. Kittens. Tiny, blind, mewling creatures, their fur barely grown in, their bodies so fragile that even the straw beneath them seemed too rough. There were several of them, 4, maybe 5, and they clung to her as though her warmth was the only thing tethering them to life. For a long moment, Michael simply stared, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It was such an ordinary thing, and yet so extraordinary here, in this place, guarded so fiercely by his dog. The pieces fell together slowly, each realization heavier than the last. Ray had not been avoiding the doghouse out of fear, nor had he been warning Michael away out of defiance. He had been protecting them, the stray mother and her fragile offspring, choosing their survival over his own comfort. Michael's chest tightened with a rush of conflicting emotions. He felt awe at the sacrifice his dog had made, pride in the compassion Ray had shown, but also a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly buckled him. He had doubted his companion, tricked him, locked him away in order to uncover a secret that was never meant to be his. And yet now, staring into that small shelter, he understood the truth. Ray had become a guardian not only of his own home, but of the helpless lives that fate had deposited there. Behind him, Ray barked again, a sound of such urgency that Michael turned instinctively to glance back at the window. The dog's body was pressed against the glass, his eyes fixed on him, wide and imploring. He was not angry, at least not entirely, but desperate to rejoin the vigil he had kept so faithfully. Michael raised a hand slightly, a gesture of reassurance, though he doubted Ray could take comfort in it. He turned back to the cat, his movements slow and careful. She hissed again, her ears flattening, her body curling more tightly around her kittens. Michael did not reach for her. He knew better than to invade her space. Instead, he drew back slightly, allowing the shadows to reclaim the view. He knelt there in the snow for a long time, his thoughts swirling as the reality of it settled in. His dog had relinquished his home, had chosen to endure the bitter cold, all for the sake of this fragile family that was not even his own species. The enormity of it filled Michael with a quiet reverence. He thought of the way Ray had stood before him each time he approached, his eyes filled with a strange sorrow, his body firm in its refusal. The dog had not been defying him for the sake of defiance. He had been holding a line that Michael himself was not meant to cross, defending the helpless creatures who would not have survived without shelter. It was an act of compassion so pure, so unselfish, that Michael felt humbled in its presence. Slowly, he rose to his feet. The snow clung to his knees, the cold biting deep, but he hardly noticed. He looked once more into the entrance, catching the gleam of the mother cat's eyes, the faint stirrings of her kittens. Then he turned toward the house. Ray's barking grew louder as he approached, his body thrashing against the door, claws scraping furiously. Michael hurried now, guilt weighing on him with each step. He reached the porch, opened the door, and barely had time to step aside before Ray burst through. The pit bull bounded across the yard, his paws spraying snow behind him, his body low and fast. He reached the doghouse in seconds, thrusting himself before the entrance once more, his body positioned exactly as it had been before. He lowered his head, his chest heaving, and then fell into a stillness as complete as if he had never moved. His eyes darted briefly to Michael, a glimmer of relief in them, but then returned to the task at hand. He was the sentinel once more, the guardian of the fragile family within. Michael stood on the porch, his hands gripping the railing, and felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never underestimated Ray's strength, never doubted his loyalty, but he had not imagined such gentleness, such sacrifice. To give up the warmth of his home, to endure the bite of winter, all for the sake of creatures he did not know, it was a lesson in kindness that Michael felt deep in his bones. That night, as he lay in bed, he could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the image again, the cat curled protectively around her young, the unwavering posture of his dog. He thought of the nights Ray had spent in the snow, the silent plea in his eyes whenever Michael drew near, the stubborn refusal that had frustrated him so much. Now it all made sense. Ray had been trying to tell him, in the only language he had, that some boundaries must not be crossed, that trust sometimes meant respecting the secrets another held. Michael rolled onto his side, staring at the darkened ceiling, and whispered a quiet promise to himself. He would not interfere again. The family in the doghouse had earned their right to be there, and Ray had chosen his role as their protector. All Michael could do now was support them both, to find a way to make their lives easier without betraying the fragile trust that bound them together. When dawn came, pale and cold, Michael stepped outside with new eyes. Ray was still there, as always, his body a shield before the doghouse. He rose when he saw his master, wagging his tail, but he did not move from his post. Michael smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his expression. He reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, murmuring soft words that were lost in the cold air. Then he straightened, looking at the small structure that now held more than just straw and shadows. It held life. It held the reason his dog had chosen sacrifice over comfort. And in that moment, Michael knew that everything had changed. The mystery was solved, but the story was far from over. He had discovered not only what lay inside the doghouse, but Also, a truth about loyalty, compassion, and the silent strength that his companion carried. It was a truth that would guide his next steps, a truth that would shape what he must now do. The morning after Michael had uncovered the secret inside the doghouse dawned pale and bitterly cold, but his heart felt strangely lighter despite the icy air. The mystery that had consumed him for weeks was no longer shrouded in darkness. He knew now what Ray had been protecting, and the revelation had left him humbled. As he stood on the porch with his coat pulled tightly around him, he looked across the snow-draped yard at the doghouse. Ray was already in position, lying as he always did, his body stretched protectively across the entrance. The sight no longer filled Michael with confusion or frustration. Instead, it stirred something else within him: respect, admiration, and a deep desire to help. The image of the mother cat and her tiny kittens was etched into his mind, fragile forms huddled together in the straw, clinging to warmth in the depths of winter. He thought of Ray's silent sacrifice, the countless nights his companion had endured the snow and cold, given up comfort for the sake of lives not his own. Michael felt a pang of guilt again, but this time it did not paralyze him. It pushed him to act. If his dog could give so much, surely he could do his part too. That day, after work, he went to the old shed at the far end of the yard. It had once been used for tools and scraps of lumber, though in recent years it had become more of a storage place for odds and ends. He opened the creaking door, the scent of old wood and dust greeting him, and surveyed the space. The walls were drafty, the floor uneven, but there was potential. He imagined what it could become: a shelter, a safe haven for the fragile feline family that had found its way into his life. For hours he worked, his breath fogging in the chill air, his hands numb from the cold but steady with purpose. He cleared out broken tools, swept away the layers of dust and dirt, and began patching gaps in the walls with planks of wood. He layered straw thickly across the floor, remembering how the kittens had looked so delicate against the rough surface of the doghouse. He fetched an old blanket from the house, folding it into a makeshift bed. Little by little, the shed transformed into something new, a place that might shield the family from the worst of the winter. Ray watched him throughout the process, his head tilted, his eyes following Michael's every move. The dog seemed to understand, though he did not abandon his post. Whenever Michael glanced toward the doghouse, he saw those watchful eyes, the silent guard unbroken. It was only when Michael finally stepped back from the shed, brushing sawdust from his coat, that Ray rose and padded slowly across the yard to inspect the work. The pit bull's nose twitched as he sniffed the entrance, his body tense as though weighing whether to trust this new construction. Michael crouched beside him, resting a hand lightly on his back, and whispered words of reassurance. Ray stayed there for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the doghouse and the shed before finally sitting down in the snow, his body relaxed. The next task was the most delicate of all. Michael knew he could not simply drag the cat and her kittens from their sanctuary. Trust was fragile, and he would not shatter it with brute force. He needed patience. So, over the next few days, he placed small offerings of food near the shed, bits of tuna, softened bread, scraps of meat, allowing the mother to grow accustomed to the scent and the space. At first, she did not move, her eyes glowing in the darkness of the doghouse, her body pressed tightly around her young. But eventually, hunger coaxed her. One night, as Michael watched quietly from the porch, he saw her slip out, her body lean and wary, her movements quick as shadows. She sniffed the food, devoured it, and then darted back inside. It took several more nights before she lingered longer, testing the edges of the shed, her ears flicking at every sound. Ray never moved from his position, though his eyes followed her intently, not with aggression but with the quiet vigilance of a guardian. Slowly, she grew less afraid, less frantic in her movements. And then, one afternoon, while the pale sun glistened weakly on the snow, she carried one of her kittens out into the yard. Michael watched in breathless silence as she padded across the snow toward the shed, the tiny creature held gently in her mouth. She vanished inside, and when she reemerged moments later, she went back for another. By nightfall, the transfer was complete. All the kittens lay huddled together in the nest Michael had made, their small bodies nestled into the folds of the old blanket. The mother cat curled around them, her eyes half closed in weariness, but no longer filled with panic. For the first time since he had discovered them, Michael felt they were truly safe. He exhaled deeply, the tension in his chest easing. His plan had worked. Ray had returned to his doghouse, reclaiming the home he had sacrificed, though he did so with a strange kind of reverence. He settled inside, his body sinking into the straw, but he did not turn his back on the shed. Even now, when the kittens no longer depended on his shelter, he remained vigilant, his gaze straying often to the new refuge. At times, he padded over, sniffing the air, ensuring all was well, before returning to his own bed. Michael could see it plainly. The dog had not relinquished his role as protector. He had simply shifted it. In the evenings, Michael found himself drawn to the shed as well. He would kneel near the entrance, speaking softly, letting the mother cat hear his voice. Sometimes she hissed still, her ears flat, but more often she only watched him, her eyes calm and unblinking. The kittens grew stronger each day, their tiny bodies more robust, their mews louder. Michael could not help but smile at the sight of them, though he kept his distance, allowing their trust to grow at its own pace. Through it all, Ray was never far. The pit bull had become more than just a dog in Michael's eyes. He was a guardian of life, a creature who had shown him the depth of compassion that existed even in those the world often feared. Michael's respect for him deepened with every passing day. He often found himself sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching as Ray lay between the two shelters, his head raised, his eyes alert. There was no sign of conflict in him, no sense that he regretted what he had given up. There was only peace, the peace of one who knows his choice was right. Michael realized then that his role had changed as well. He was no longer just the master, the provider of food and warmth. He had become a caretaker not only for his dog, but for the fragile family that fate had delivered into their lives. It was a responsibility he accepted willingly, one that filled him with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. As winter deepened, the bond between them all grew stronger. The yard, once just a place of snow and silence, now held the heartbeat of something larger, a community of lives woven together by chance and compassion. Michael could not have predicted it, and yet he would not have traded it for anything. He knew now that kindness was not limited by species, nor by expectation. It was something that flowed freely where it was needed most, binding together the unlikely and the unexpected. One evening, as he stood in the doorway with Ray at his side, he looked out across the yard. The shed glowed softly in the light of the lantern he had hung by its entrance, the mother cat's silhouette visible within as she curled protectively around her young. The doghouse stood solid once more, Ray's presence filling it with life. And Michael, with his hands in his pockets and the quiet weight of contentment in his chest, felt that the world, despite its coldness, had offered him something rare and beautiful. He glanced down at Ray, whose eyes met his in the dim light. The dog's tail thumped softly against the straw, a sound of quiet affirmation. Michael reached down, resting his hand on the pit bull's broad head, and whispered words he had spoken many times, but that now carried new meaning. Good boy. The story was not finished. The kittens would grow, the seasons would change, and the challenges of life would return. But for now, in the heart of winter, there was peace. And Michael knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that it had all begun with a choice of sacrifice, of loyalty, and of love. The days turned into weeks, and winter deepened its grip on the neighborhood, the snow piling higher along the fences and weighing heavily on the branches of the bare trees. The wind swept across the open yards with a mournful sound, rattling windows and stinging faces, but within Michael's property there was a sense of warmth that defied the season. The small shed he had transformed now glowed each evening with the faint light of the lantern he hung at its door, casting a circle of comfort against the darkness. Inside, the mother cat and her kittens thrived, their once fragile bodies gaining strength, their mews growing louder and more insistent as they explored their little world. Michael often stood in the doorway of his house, watching the life that unfolded before him. There was a quiet rhythm now, a balance that had been established since the family of strays had taken up residence. Ray had reclaimed his doghouse, yet he had not abandoned his vigil. He often rose from his bed to patrol between the two shelters, his paws crunching through the snow as he checked on the shed. Sometimes he lay in the middle of the yard, his head raised and his ears perked, as if to make sure no harm approached from any direction. Other times he simply sat before the shed's entrance, his eyes fixed on the mother cat within. She no longer hissed at him, no longer shrank away. Instead, she would look back at him calmly, her trust growing slowly but steadily, until even his great bulk no longer seemed a threat. The kittens themselves grew bold. At first, they stayed pressed against their mother's side, tiny balls of fur barely able to move. But as their eyes opened and their legs strengthened, they began to tumble across the straw, chasing one another clumsily, their small bodies colliding as they learned the art of play. Occasionally, they would wander near the threshold, peeking into the snowy world beyond. When they ventured too far, Ray would shift slightly, lowering his head to sniff at them, guiding them back with gentle nudges. Michael marveled at the sight, unable to believe that this dog, whose breed was so often misunderstood, could show such tenderness. Word of the unusual arrangement began to spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson from across the street noticed first, seeing the kittens dart in and out of the shed when she passed by. She had stopped Michael one morning as he was shoveling snow, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Is your dog really letting them stay?" she asked, pointing toward the yard. Michael had smiled, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold, and nodded. Soon, others came to ask, curious and incredulous. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how pit bulls were dangerous, incapable of such gentleness. But others were touched, their voices hushed with admiration. They spoke of Ray as though he were a legend in the making, a guardian who defied the prejudices of men. Michael did not boast of it. He did not tell the story with embellishment or flourish. Instead, he simply described what had happened, how Ray had chosen to give up his own shelter, how he had stood guard without fail, how he had shown a compassion that seemed almost human in its depth. And each time he spoke of it, he felt his chest swell with pride, not for himself, but for the dog who had taught him more about loyalty and kindness than he had ever thought possible. The weeks continued, and the kittens grew stronger. Their fur thickened against the cold, their movements became more sure, and their personalities began to shine. One was bold, always the first to tumble out into the snow and paw at Ray's tail. Another was cautious, lingering in the doorway and watching the world with wide, thoughtful eyes. The others darted and pounced, filling the yard with a liveliness that brought laughter to Michael's lips even after long days at the garage. He would return home, weary and smelling of oil and iron, and find himself greeted not only by the wag of Ray's tail, but by the playful antics of the kittens scampering near the shed. Ray remained the steady center of it all. He did not join in the play as another dog might, but he tolerated the kittens' games with endless patience. When they climbed onto his back, he stayed still, his muscles taut but controlled, allowing them to scramble over him as though he were a part of the landscape. When they nipped at his ears or tail, he gave a low chuff, a sound that was more amused than annoyed. And always, when they wandered too far, he guided them back, his nose nudging them gently toward safety. Michael found himself reflecting often in those quiet moments. He thought about the way life had changed, how a simple act of compassion had rippled outward until it had transformed his home. He realized that the lesson was not just about animals, not just about his dog or the kittens. It was about the nature of kindness itself, how it demanded sacrifice, how it asked for nothing in return, and how it could cross boundaries of species, of fear, of misunderstanding. He thought, too, about how easy it would have been to miss it all, to force Ray aside, to drive the strays away in the name of order. And the thought made him shiver, not from cold, but from the recognition of how close he had come to losing something beautiful. As the season turned slowly toward spring, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and the first shoots of green grass. The kittens grew bolder still, darting across the yard in little packs, their paws leaving trails in the damp soil. The mother cat watched them carefully, but she no longer looked so gaunt, her body filling out with strength as she thrived in the safety of the shed. Michael often brought her food, setting it down with quiet care, and she no longer hissed or flinched. Instead, she would meet his eyes briefly, a flicker of gratitude in her gaze before returning to her meal. Neighbors stopped by more often, children pressing their faces to the fence to catch glimpses of the kittens tumbling in the grass. Some even asked if they might adopt one when the time came, their voices filled with excitement. Michael smiled at their eagerness, though he knew it would be hard to let them go. He had grown attached to the little family, to the way they had changed the rhythm of his life, but he also knew that kindness did not mean possession. It meant giving others the chance at safety, at love, at a life beyond the struggle of survival. Through it all, Ray remained unchanged in his devotion. Even as the kittens grew less vulnerable, even as they began to climb and run and explore the world with reckless abandon, he kept his watch. He seemed to know that his task was not finished, that as long as they remained under his care, he would be their guardian. And Michael, watching him, felt a pride that was almost overwhelming. He had always known Ray was strong, but now he understood the true measure of that strength. It was not in the power of his muscles or the force of his bark, but in the gentleness of his heart. One evening, As the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Michael sat on the porch with Ray at his feet. The kittens tumbled across the yard, their tiny forms glowing in the fading light, while the mother cat watched from the shed with calm eyes. Michael took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and felt a peace settle over him. Life was still hard, still filled with long days at the garage, bills to pay, challenges to face. But here, in this yard, there was something pure, something that gave him strength to face it all. He reached down to scratch Ray behind the ears, his voice low and steady. "You've done more than I ever could have asked," he whispered. Ray's tail thumped softly against the porch, his eyes closing in contentment. Michael looked out again at the scene before him, at the unlikely family that had come together by chance and been bound by compassion, and he realized that this was a story worth remembering, worth telling, not because it was extraordinary in scale, but because it revealed something extraordinary in the ordinary. It was a story of kindness, of trust, of the quiet power of sacrifice. As the last light of day faded into the calm of evening, Michael knew that the lesson would remain with him forever. He had seen loyalty not only in the devotion of his dog, but in the bond that had formed across species, across fear, across the divide of what should have been natural enemies. He had seen that true strength lay not in force, but in protection, not in dominance, but in care. And with that understanding, he felt richer than he had in all his years. The night grew quiet again, the stars beginning to emerge one by one in the deepening sky. The kittens curled together in the shed, their soft breaths blending into the silence. Ray lay stretched at Michael's feet, his body warm against the cool air, and Michael, sitting in the stillness of his yard, knew that he was witnessing something rare, something fleeting yet eternal. A story of kindness, simple and profound, written in the snow and the straw, in the eyes of a dog and the fragile lives he had chosen to protect. Don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you never miss what happens next. Watch our other videos for even more shocking discoveries and heartwarming moments you won't believe. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Let them experience the surprise too.